So my presentation is about media discourse and social change, the collapse of communist language in Rudé právo, the party mouthpiece, during the Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution in 1989. So you kind of can imagine what it will be about, right? So I will start with the notion of a coherent communist media system, basically something that is different from our current media system, that is different, but it's kind of coherent. We have the theories about this already from the 1950s. If you know or remember the four theories of press by Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm, basically they have been basing their grasp of the different media systems out there in the East. They were basing it on Lenin's articles on the press that have been published like in the newspapers at the time, but basically the basic notion or basic quote from Lenin that the press should be not only a collective propagandist and collective agitator, but also a collective organizer of the masses. So this has been Lenin's quote, but basically they have been looking at it from the critical perspective. So basically the Western analytics of the Eastern media were saying that the media in the communist countries, basically they are just following the party line. They are not really free. They are the mouthpieces of the party. There were some problems with the four theories of the press and of the Western views of that were kind of like making the communist media system as some kind of monolith. That first, some people might say that Marx, Engels, and other communist leaders at various points argued for freedom of the press, actually, at least for the freedom of the communist press within the bourgeois media system. But what is more important or interesting is that even in the communist-ruled countries, when the Communist Party has been in power, there were different developments over time. There have been differences across the countries. So there have been some Stalinist eras or Stalinist kind of more Stalinist countries. There were also some reform periods where things were more free, even in the area of the media. So things are a little bit more complicated than this general idea. Anyway, there is another very much linked idea, linked with the previous idea of the coherent media system, and it's the idea of the coherent communist discourse, the kind of communist language, like that the party state speaks in a particular way. We can go back to George Orwell and his idea of newspeak, or Václav Havel's ptidepe, that's kind of like paint a picture of some kind of monolithic, inflexible, or tautological language that is not really very much connected to the reality. We have some studies that are focusing specifically on the Czech communist discourse. One is by Petr Fidelius, the other one is by Vladimir Matsura. They have been written before 1989, but they have been obviously published only after that. But there are also like these studies from other countries too. I know about Poland or Romania, they have been doing similar things. In general, like they are saying that the communist discourse describes some imaginary instead of the real world that is kind of simulacrum, right? Then there is the voice of the media is kind of voicing the we. It's both the regime and the audience, or sometimes only the Communist Party, or sometimes only the leadership of the Communist Party. So it's kind of not really sure for whom the voice of the media speak. The media, they are not supposed to have their own voice. They are the mouthpieces of the regime, and they create a dichotomy of the people versus the enemy of the people, the us and them, so on. So basically, these might be the basic features of the communist discourse as kind of analyzed by the critics of the communist discourse. I think we can illustrate this point on an article about the protests against the regime that happened in 1988, published in Rudé právo, the Communist Party mouthpiece. You can see here, it was a very short article hidden on page 2 of the newspaper. And well, I think it's a very good example of the way how the party state and its media have been handling the protests. you can see basically, you can see that, well, it's about the disturbances against the communist status quo, right? And, well, the content of the disturbances or the agenda of the protest is actually not really mentioned. Basically, it was the protest, like several thousand people were gathering on the Wenceslas Square, and it ended up by a crackdown with the police. So, well, in this article, you will not find out the most important information, but it's some kind of story that starts with the disturbance of the status quo and then ends up with re-establishing of the status quo. There are some particular actors, like the protesters, that are delegitimized, and then the police that is kind of like seeing the actor of re-establishing the status quo, and so on and so on. There have been several other protests between 1988 and 1989, and the communist discourse, well, the articles published in the communist media about this protest have been basically the same. They have been always treating the protest in the same way, and the elements of this particle discourse were the same language used for all the anti-Russian protests before the November 1989. So, well, it would seem that the communist discourse on the protest has been indeed monolithic, following the same logic, using the same elements, so basically in line with all the critical accounts of how the communist discourse will be working. I here have some discourse characteristics. I have been mentioning them briefly. It's us versus them, status quo versus disturbance of the status quo, and eventual re-establishment of the status quo. They have been also denouncing the violence of the protesters. No mentioning of the violence by the police, obviously. They have been also pointing out the protesters' cluelessness, like they are not rational, they don't have any idea what they are doing, why they are protesting. It is irrational to protest because there can be some bad consequences for you. And the mechanism how this has been established and kept running, it was like some top-down like instructions for the media how they should be covering these things. Also, the journalists and editors were more or less reliable. In Rudé, právo, they have been more reliable because they have been required to be the Communist Party members. There have been also some control mechanisms making sure that the media and journalists follow the line. That if they would commit some errors, like their circulation will be cut, they will not get enough paper to print all their copies and so on. So, in general, those articles, I would describe them as evaluations first, facts second, and being silent or explaining away anything inconvenient, right? Like the agenda of the protest was inconvenient, so it was not mentioned. However, what if the inconvenience does not simply go away, as has been the case after the start of the protest in November 17, right? We have been now celebrating the 31 years of this. So 31 years ago, this was going on. Basically, the protest in Czechoslovakia on Wenceslas Square were growing, and the Communist Party or the regime was not doing anything against that. So the critical accounts of communist media systems would kind of say that this media discourse was some kind of simulacrum that was disconnected from the reality, right? But there was still some kind of reality behind it. Well, what was going on in November 1989 with Rudé, právo is kind of a contra-argument against that, because, well, the discourse had to react somehow on the changing reality, because it was no longer possible to continue in the old way. The police was not cracking down on the protests, so the protests were no longer unsuccessful, and, well, at the same time, it was impossible to stay silent and ignore them, because, like, all the other media were covering them. However, the party was silent, so, like, the mouthpiece could not kind of voice any messages from the top, so they have been left alone. So the communist discourse quickly collapsed. It could not handle the new realities. Here I have kind of like graphic summary of how we can kind of communicate this collapse of the discourse. Basically, I have kind of frame it as inversion or neutralization or abandonment of key features. Like the features of the communist discourse about the protest that we have seen before, They have been still there 1 day after the protest or 3 days after the protest, but then after the initial protest, but then the protest grew and grew and grew, and it was no longer possible to handle it in the same way. So you see that some of the features that have been there disappeared. Some have been kind of like more ambivalent, like they are not that good or not that bad, and some were simply inverted. Like you cannot say that the protests are a failure when they are clearly a success, they are growing, right? So, well, we can capture this change in a way that like you abandon some previous characteristics of the discourse. You can retain some of them, but basically like there is also some neutralization, like what have been before strong yes or strong no is more ambivalent, and there is also some inversion. You were saying about something that is bad, now you admit that it might be good, or the other way around, right? So my conclusion, what I kind of want to say with these things is that the communist discourse, at least in the late communist Czechoslovakia before the collapse, indeed was coherent and following a party line, which would be kind of in line with the Soviet theory of the press from the old Cold War era accounts on the communist media from the Western perspective. However, it was not a pure simulacrum. There has been some relationship to the reality, because once the regime started to collapse, the discourse also started to collapse. The collapses went hand in hand in a way. The new discourse, I would say, has been kind of negation of the old one. The old key characteristics of the discourse has been abandoned or neutralized or inverted. But, well, my question would be how much or how the old and the new discourses really reflected the reality, because, well, it has been evolutions first, fact second, even before, but also after that. They just kind of changed the way how they have been evaluating some actors or some events or some agenda, but they have not been really focused. It was not about the facts so much, it was about the evaluations, this type of discourse. So my question is like, okay, how much was the discourse before and after really connected to the reality? Okay, that's from me. Thank you for your attention.